النسيان أو النسيان واستكره عليه وما استكره عليه. حديث حسن رواه ابن ماجه والبيهقي وغيرهما. So this is a beautiful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which he mentions that so Ibn Abbas narrates on the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ said that indeed Allah has pardoned for me, for my ummah, those who have made mistakes, who are forgetful, or like have made mistakes because they're forgetful, or who was coerced or was under duress. And so essentially the meaning of this hadith is that if you commit a mistake, you commit a sin, or you forget to do something that's farad, in one of these states, which you make a mistake, you forget, or someone forces you to, then you're not held accountable for that. And so we'll have a discussion about that, inshallah. So first of all, just a brief discussion on the isnad of this hadith. It might be like a good point to just get into more of the details here. And so this hadith is a hadith that's classified as Hasan li ghayrihi. So there's different classifications on hadith generally. There's common terms we've heard like sahih, which is authentic, or hasan, which is good. Da'if is something we maybe have heard before, which is weak. So this is a hadith that in and of itself, its own chain is weak, which means that one of the narrators inside that chain was known as a weak narrator. But because of other hadith that have the same meaning as it, as well as other verses from the Quran that support the meaning of this hadith, it's actually considered still an authentic narration. It's considered hasan, like a good narration, because of the support that comes to it. So we'll go over some of the support for it. And so the main takeaway from that conversation is essentially that hadith are not black and white. Oftentimes you just put things in buckets like sahih and forget everything else. But there's a lot more gradient to it, and there's a lot we can benefit from. Even da'if hadith that exist out there, there's still a benefit that you can derive from it. So in the Quran, there's like a similar kind of meaning that's brought up in different verses in the Quran. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 286, it says, رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا إِن نَسِينَا أَوْ أَخْطَأْنَا. O our Lord, do not impose blame upon us if we have forgotten or made an error. And then there's another verse in Surah Al-Nahl, for example, it mentions, whoever disbelieves in Allah after believing, except those, so it's in a context like the verses before it are talking about punishment for people who are disbelieving in Allah, and who turn back from Islam to kufr. And it mentions those people who believe in Allah after believing, except those who are forced to renounce their faith while their heart is still secure in faith. So here it's mentioning the story, it's in reference to the story of a Sahabi. The Sahabi's name is Ammar bin Yasir, radiallahu anhuma. He was, his family was a poor family in Mecca, and they were immigrant family in Mecca. And so his parents were actually tortured to death, and his mom was the first shaheed in Islam. She was actually the first martyr in Islam. And she was brutally, very vulgarly killed in a period of torture, and his father was then killed through torture, and he himself was being tortured. And after all this, Abu Jahl, the person who's murdering and torturing him, murdering his family and torturing him, said that you just need to renounce the Prophet ﷺ, and you need to curse the Prophet. And so after all this, he couldn't handle it, and he cursed the Prophet. And he felt so much remorse after that he thought that was it. Like he thought that he had become Muslim and he left Islam and he could never become Muslim again, that God would never forgive him. And so he was just depressed. He lost his family, he was tortured, and now he's lost his religion, he thought. And so this verse talks about that situation and anyone who's in a similar situation where because he was under duress, he was forced to convert, but his heart was still attached to Islam, then he's not sinful, he's not held responsible for that at all. And there's another hadith, there's many other hadith that kind of have a similar concept. One other hadith that comes up is Prophet ﷺ mentioned someone who does ijtihad, someone who does their full effort in trying to arrive at a ruling, a scholar who puts their full effort to arrive at a ruling, and if they get that ruling right, then they've received double the reward. But if they get the ruling wrong, then they get a single reward. They don't get any punishment, they don't get sin for getting the ijtihad wrong. Rather, they actually get a reward for trying, even if they get it wrong. So here, the first idea that comes up is that even though they've made a mistake, it's a mistake. They tried their best effort. Ijtihad means to put your best effort forward. You've looked at all the resources, you've consulted people, you're more than qualified, you've done years of your education, and after all that, you've put your effort forward and you arrived at a mistake, then that means there's no ill intention, there's no laziness on your part, so you can't be held responsible for that. It's not talking about people who are just making up rulings for themselves or trying to take the easy way out. It needs to be someone who's qualified, who's coming up with these rulings. And so this is something that's also specific to our ummah. And the hadith that mentions, the Prophet ﷺ, in this narration, he's mentioning, تجاوز لي عن ummati. So it's like Allah has pardoned on my behalf, my ummah. And so it's specific to the ummah of Islam, our ummah. And another kind of dalil, another kind of like evidence for that is another verse in the Quran. وَمَا تَحْمِلْ عَلَيْنَا إِسْرًا كَمَا حَمَلْتَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِنَا. Do not bear upon us the burden that you have bore upon the people of the past. And it's kind of referring to this idea that people of the past were held to almost a higher standard. They were held to, like, even if they made mistakes, that they could still be sinful for those mistakes, or if they had been forgetful in something, that they could still be responsible for that. And so here the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning in the hadith that this is no longer the case for our ummah, and it's a special kind of gift from Allah to forgive our ummah. Yet despite that, the Prophet ﷺ still, even though in the Quran it mentions this topic multiple times, even though the Prophet ﷺ himself mentioned many hadith on this topic, he would still make dua all the time for like he would ask Allah to forgive his mistakes and his forgetfulness, and to forgive his ummah. So this doesn't mean that you can't or you should not make dua. On the contrary, you should actually make more dua for Allah to forgive your mistakes and your forgetfulness and things that you didn't intend to do. But rather, this just to give us hope that Allah will be will forgive our sins that we make in mistakes. So of course, this is kind of just to take the conversation, make it a little more nuanced. This is not kind of like a blanket statement. This is really talking about the relationship between us and Allah. Sins that we commit between us and Allah, like those are not something that we're going to be held accountable for. But when you make a mistake, sometimes there's consequences in this life, and you can't escape those consequences. And so this hadith is not saying that you get like a blank slate, you get like there's no blame at all, because sometimes when you make a mistake in the world, there are consequences to that mistake. And so some things, for example, that come up, if someone forgets to pray rak'ah in salah, so that person who forgets to pray rak'ah in salah, that salah does not count. This hadith is not trying to say that salah is not a full salah, but it just says that you're not sinful for having missed that salah now, and that's something you should make up. On the other hand, there's like, if someone is like, for example, going to slaughter an animal, and they forget to say Bismillah and they slaughter the animal, then many scholars, most scholars even, would say that that animal, just because it was not, the intention was not to not say it, it was just the person intended to say it, but they forgot to say it in that moment, then that animal will still be halal to eat. So again, this is like, there's a lot of other principles that play here. It's not just this one principle in Islamic law. There's a lot of other principles that balance out, and people make ijtihad, make rulings through those different principles. And so there's kind of a distinction that's made between khata, shubh al-khata, and amd, which is essentially mistakes, pseudo-mistakes, and something that's intended, that's full intention. And maybe a good example for this is, let's say people are playing baseball, and the pitcher throws a baseball, and it hits the batter in the head, and that kills the person. That's one scenario where the person is completely, he was a mistake, it was an accident, had no intention. Now let's take a different scenario. Let's say that the pitcher didn't like the batter, and they wanted to hit them like in the shoulder, just to like hurt them mildly or to just frustrate them. But then they accidentally hit them in the head and it kills them. So that's a different situation than the first situation, which it was totally an accident, but there's still not an intention to have the same, to kill the person. There's not that intention of having full consequence. And then there's the amd, which is like the pitcher just goes, picks up a baseball bat and just like intends to kill somebody. So those are three different levels, like a totally different situation, and each one would have their own rulings. But there's still like the outcome of the person dying, and there's still like legal action that needs to take place in this world. And then there's another situation, for example, Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the hadith that three things occur, whether they're serious or if they're in jest, if they're a joke. One is freeing a slave, the other is marriage, and the third is divorce. So if someone says, that I divorce you, and they're just like joking, that's not something you can joke about. Like that still can count. If it meets all the like requirements of a divorce or for like asking for marriage, then it'll still count legally. And so these are things that even if you might make a mistake with them, there's still like legal ramifications to those mistakes. And so another thing, for example, is let's say like you forget something that you're commanded to do. So like there's really like four situations that kind of come up. So let's say you forget something that you're commanded to do. So like let's say you miss salah. Then there's no sin at all. It's something between you and Allah, and you've missed it, you've made a mistake, you didn't mean to miss salah, you don't like usually try to miss salah, it's just you forgot, you didn't wake up, whatever happened. then there's no sin on that. You still make up the salah, but there's no sin for that. Then there's a situation which you do something prohibited, and there's no harm caused to anybody else. And again, in that situation, that person is totally forgiven. It's between them and God. They seek forgiveness. There's no blame on that person. Let's say like you accidentally drink alcohol, for example. You think it's water, and it turns out to be alcohol. You accidentally drink it. There's no legal punishment for that person. That person's not held accountable because there's no intention there. But sometimes you do something that's prohibited, and it causes harm or damage to somebody else. And in that situation, again, there's no sin involved, but you're responsible for the damage. So let's say you're driving your car and you accidentally, you hit someone else's car. And so you're still responsible for the damage that you caused, but there's no sin. It's not sinful in the same way as like if you had intentionally rammed your car into someone else. And then the last situation is if you do something that usually entails a legal punishment, but it was an accident. So for example, in a situation of, let's say like in a war or conflict, someone does like friendly fire. So you killed someone on your side, usually that's has a really high level of punishment. But if you can prove that there was no intention behind it, it was an act of accident, then you would have a different legal punishment for it than like the punishment of someone who intended to do it. And so these are like things that that would happen if you had like an entire legal system, of course. But they're good to like kind of distinguish in our heads for now. And then there's a situation of let's see. Oh, the other thing that also comes up pretty often is like, let's say you go somewhere and you eat food that's, you ask the person like, is this food halal? That person says, yeah, this food is halal. And so you eat. And then you find out like a week later, someone else tells you, you do your research, and you find out for sure that that place was not halal. That situation, again, it's not something that you have blame on, because in the moment, you did your best. You asked the person, they gave you a firm response, like you did your investigation. So as long as you put forward your effort, then you can't be held responsible for not having done that mistake. And then just like on a side note on that, there's like a concept in Islam, al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak. So that means like essentially that what you know for certain cannot be undone with doubt. So if someone's like starting like to spread rumors that place is, you know that this place is halal and has halal food, and then people are spreading rumors that place might not be halal, that doesn't make it not halal to eat. You should do your investigation, obviously, but if your investigation shows that it's halal, then that means it's halal. It doesn't matter if people are adding doubt, because what's yaqeen, which is certain, which is that it was halal, is not undone by the doubtful. Only when you're given solid evidence does it become not halal then. And then what is ikrah? And so ikrah here, like this, ikrah, which is like the last condition that was mentioned, is essentially like when someone is forced or coerced to do something. And that's something, again, that's subjective. Like many scholars in the past have tried to kind of put a definition of like what's the cutoff for coercion, like how much pain or how much, like what is exactly a coercive act. But it really depends on the person. Like what's, coercive for one person might be tolerable to someone else. Like if someone, is being threatened with something, to one person that might be serious, might be like the end of their world, and they'll no matter what, they'll confess, for example. Whereas for someone else, they're like willing to bear it. So this is something that's very subjective. But the overall idea is that Islam does not ask you to put yourself or other people in harm's way. You're allowed to say or do whatever you need to do externally to preserve yourself, because the faith is something that's in your heart. Like no one can take that away from you on the inside. It's like something that's inside of you. But of course, this is about legal responsibility and sinfulness. It's always better to like resist, of course, oppression, to resist people who are trying to turn you away from the faith or do something haram. So resist if you can. But it's just saying that there's no accountability if you cannot. And that's essentially the point of that. And it's like this hadith, of course, is very, very important. There's even scholars who have said that this is half our deen, because everything we do is either we do it intentionally or we do it unintentionally. So this covers basically everything that's done unintentionally. So it's a very important hadith. And the last thing is like, why is it being brought here? This is hadith number 39. In the hadith collection is 42 hadith. It's not 40, it's actually 42. So we're almost at the end of it basically. There's only 3 more hadith after this. So why is Imam Nawawi bringing it in this position over here towards the end? Some people have speculated essentially that this is like towards the end of the book. At the beginning of the book, Imam Nawawi started with intention, so that actions are with intentions. So you start off an act with good intentions, and here he's asking Allah essentially to forgive him for any mistakes, and kind of like let the reader know also that the book is coming to a close. And so with that, inshallah, we ask Allah to forgive us for our mistakes, and to, inshallah, guide us to the right path and benefit from these hadith, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.